My name is Dominique. I'm the St. Paul Federation of Educators community organizer, and I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about the political context behind some of what we're seeing today. So U.S. immigration law has always been very racialized. It's always been related to labor exploitation. Some of the earliest founding documents for the United States government reserve citizenship for, quote, whites of good moral character. A lot of the foundation of U.S. law and policy is in the erasure of indigenous people and anti-blackness, and we continue to see this today through some recent evolutions. So some important history of note, if you'd like to look up any of these moments on your own, then you could find out some more greater context. But the Chinese Exclusion Act was written in response to increases in Chinese immigration toward the end of the 19th century, when the United States government started to forbid the entry of Chinese immigrants to the United States. The U.S.-Japan Gentleman's Agreement was somewhat similar, only it happened as an agreement between the U.S. government and Japan to limit the amount of Japanese immigrants who would be admitted legal entry to the United States, and that's supposed to read 1907 to 1908. The Johnson-Reed Act was something that started to establish national quotas for folks of different nations who were immigrating to the United States and start to set limits on those based on nationality. It was later lifted after the Civil Rights Act and some more legislation which found that that was unconstitutional. Another noteworthy moment was the Bracero program. The Bracero program was the first large-scale guest worker visa program in the history of the United States, and it allowed laborers who were primarily Mexican to be able to enter the United States on work visas to do work largely in agricultural fields, but it also included workers from Guam. And then we jump forward up to a more recent history with the creation of Homeland Security under the George W. Bush administration. Why I think this is noteworthy is that this is where the creation of ICE came from and the modernization of Customs and Border Protection. Previously, the Immigration and Naturalization Services, a civilian agency, was primarily responsible for implementing immigration policy, but now we see a specifically military organization taking on a lot of that law and policy as it relates to immigrant communities. Again, more recently was DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This came as a result of Democratic legislators and the Obama administration trying to pass a Full Dream Act, which would create a pathway to citizenship, which wasn't able to be fully realized. Instead, what we had was DACA, or Deferred Action, which essentially means that for folks who immigrated to the United States as young people, that they would be the action to detain and or deport them would be deferred by a number of years so that they were able to finish important paperwork and normalize their citizenship. And so it was intended to prevent people from being detained and deported. And then we've also had comprehensive immigration reform. We've had a lot of it in the 2000s and most recently in 2013, when comprehensive immigration reform helped to outline that pathway to citizenship, but it also came at the cost of having unprecedented funds for border militarization. So those of you likely remember that during the first Trump administration, there was what was called the Muslim ban, which was a ban on several countries that were predominantly Muslim that prevented their entry to the United States for travel. And Trump promised to bring back the Muslim ban, and now it's been expanded. So this new travel ban was issued via an executive order when the Trump administration claimed that there was a state of emergency related to immigration, and issued this ban, which involves these 12 countries. It's interesting to think about these countries, think about the student population that you serve, think of how many of them their country of origin is here. And in addition to these 12 countries which face more of a full-out ban, there are additional restrictions placed on these other 7 nations that you can read here. If folks are not exempt, then nationals from those banned countries will no longer be able to enter the U.S. starting June 9th, 2025, and we haven't seen this ban lifted or shifted yet. Now, there are some exemptions to the new travel ban. Some of these exemptions are fairly common sense and straightforward, such as folks who hold a green card, dual nationals who have a U.S. passport, but it's also interesting to see where some of the carve-outs and additional permissions were given for some folks who maybe were diplomats for the United States or for allied United States nations, people who worked on behalf of the United States government, such as been the case with Afghanistan, or what are considered ethnic and religious minorities persecuted in Iran, which I think is very interesting given the United States' stance on the Iranian government. So you can take some time to read through these. You could certainly do your own research and find out the more detailed reasons and exemptions behind that, but this is definitely important to note. Now we're going to take some time to talk about where we're seeing a lot of immigrants being detained and funneled into deportation. Certainly a lot of the rules are out the window as ICE ramps up its presence in several cities, and with the new Supreme Court ruling in September of 2025 that enabled racial profiling and the threats from the Trump administration to dispatch ICE as a very specific task force hunting down people in their homes and communities all over the United States. So typically, ICE will hold contracts with several state and federal facilities where the people they can detain, or the people that they have detained, can be jailed. Sometimes it doesn't have to have a formal agreement between ICE and the facility, but they will be housed in just various county jails. In Minnesota, these jails are Carver County, Freeborn County, Nobles County, and Sherburne County, and I believe that processes are underway to allow something closer to the Twin Cities metro area to start to house some of these detainees. Immigrants have been taken into custody when showing up for their regularly scheduled immigration hearings. So even if folks are working on finishing their paperwork, if they are going through their hearings as had been previously scheduled, they're now being intercepted by ICE and taken home before they can have a chance to follow through with the process of normalizing their status. So obviously people have felt threatened by that. They felt that it wasn't safe to attend their own immigration hearings, which can obviously cause a lapse in your status. One way folks have been trying to get around this or to respond to this is by requesting Zoom hearings. There is a list of immigration attorneys that we can include in the resources with this presentation, where folks will be able to talk you through that process to teach you how you can request that Zoom hearing so you can take your hearing from home or from a safe place. Monarca Rapid Response Network organizes legal observer trainings to accompany migrants into the courtroom. These trainings are open to members of the public, and we work to circulate those as much as we find out about them. Witnesses cannot prevent or interfere with ICE's actions, but they can offer important support and presence and ensure that there is an emergency plan in place if someone is detained. Lastly, a very helpful resource is if you suspect someone you know has been detained by ICE, you can look them up with this link here. This is the ICE Detainee Locator website. You can also just Google that, ICE Detainee Locator, and you can find this tool where you will need either their full name and country of origin or just their A number. ICE's presence in the community has been unprecedented in recent months. The new administration has allocated a massive amount of funding for immigration enforcement, which includes the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which stands to triple ICE's budget. And so the Supreme Court has granted them carte blanche to be able to pick people up in whichever way they see fit. We're seeing more aggressive attacks through surveillance, removing access to health care, and increased deportation efforts without due process. We've also seen ICE be heavily politicized and used to target political opponents. And so a lot of a lot of folks who are immigrants and who are vulnerable in their status situation have been targeted through their engagement organizing against ICE, organizing for sanctuary, or organizing on behalf of Palestine. As just some examples. ICE is also specifically targeting sanctuary cities. Sanctuary policies of individual municipalities and institutions such as schools and places of worship are being challenged at the federal level. So far, we haven't seen an official policy shift at the federal level, but we have seen a shift in ICE's norms where they have told us that they are unwilling to respect those sanctuary policies or separation ordinances. Businesses that rely on undocumented labor are more likely to be raided, and we've seen certainly a lot of workplace raids at very large scales throughout the state of Minnesota. Now, about the changes to the sensitive location policy that I alluded to when I was talking about sanctuaries. So, in 2011, a sensitive locations policy was adopted by ICE, and it was reaffirmed in 2021 under the Biden administration. It discouraged ICE enforcement action to take place in what are called sensitive locations, so primarily thinking places of worship and schools, but it did not prohibit that enforcement. Individual agents and officers were required to exercise their own judgment and analyze the facts on a case-by-case basis and get supervisors' approval. And so looking for folks who were potentially charged with a crime or wanted for other reasons, as opposed to a wider dragnet just targeting people who may be undocumented. Now we're in a different reality where even that niceness is being ignored, and the official policy was rescinded. New directives from ICE state that officers frequently apply enforcement discretion, whichever that means. Going forward, law enforcement officers should continue to use that discretion along with a healthy dose of common sense, which in my mind is really just good PR to prevent them or allow them to have plausible deniability when what we're seeing is folks are just being kidnapped left and right. And then we have federal and Minnesota law that is intended to protect folks. It is intended to prevent targeted enforcement, even if those laws are being ignored by the current administration. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act is a major federal policy, and you can read through that policy if you'd like. And then here in Minnesota, we have what's called the Human Rights Act, which is upholding the protections within the Civil Rights Act, but is also very specific to ensure that people are not discriminated against in education, especially because of one or more of the following: race, color, creed, national origin, sex, gender identity, marital status, disability, status with regard to public assistance, sexual orientation, and age.